This is Writers Not Writing, the show where you can get to know your favorite writers and soon-to-be favorite writers by listening to them confess to the ways they procrastinate. Thanks for procrastinating with us. I'm Benjamin Gorman, and the quiet guy behind the glass there is Doug the producer. I write novels and collections of poetry and stuff. Doug tries his best to make me sound better. And each week we have a secret word to listen for. If you catch it, you earn the right to take an extra break at the time of your choosing from whatever is stressing you out. From NotAPipePublishing, welcome to Writers Not Writing.
Today's secret phrase is fur babies.
If I take my time.
Hail and well met, readers and reviewers. I'm very excited about today's show. Today's guest is Wendy Van Camp. Wendy Van Camp, a speculative poet, author, and writing coach. As the Poet Laureate Emerita of Anaheim, she's left an indelible mark on the city's cultural landscape. Her novel, The Curate's Brother, offers a fresh twist on Jane Austen's classic Persuasion. Delighting Regency romance enthusiasts, Wendy's passion for the cosmos shines in The Planets, a scifaiku poetry collection, a book that earned her an Elgin Award nomination. Her talent for micropoetry has also garnered her a Pushcart Prize and a Dwarf Store Awards nomination. When she's not crafting verse or prose, Wendy hosts and is a panelist on podcasts, sharing her love of storytelling with the world. Dive into her universe of words where history meets the stars and inspiration is always just a page away. Welcome, Wendy. Very glad to have you here today.
Thank you, Benjamin. I'm glad to be here.
So, as folks who are watching on YouTube can see, we always dress up in costume like this for the show, but the folks who are listening on the podcast have no idea about that amazing costume you're wearing. So tell everybody what you're wearing today.
I'd be glad to. In the misty ether of Venus, Captain Wendy Van Camp commands her futuristic airship with unmatched skill and tenacity. Standing at 5'1" tall, her presence looms larger than life among the brass and steam of her floating vessel. Shoulder-length brown hair, perpetually tossed by the humid winds of the Venetian sky, frames a face marked by both determination and the faint smudges of engine grease. Dressed in a tailored leather flight jacket adorned with intricate silver filigree, she is the fusion of elegance and utility. Her goggles, perched atop her short top hat, reflect the glint of distant nebulae, while her gray eyes, sharp and inquisitive, scan the horizon for adventure. Brown kit gloves grace her keyboard. A sterling Celtic dragon pin gleams on her lapel. And that's how I'm dressed today.
Excellent. And I wanted to match. So I'm wearing a crew person's uniform. Both got to have these goggles. So I've got similar goggles for the Venetian atmosphere. It's always a little hazy, but it's got those blinding glittering crystals. So we need these special filters in our goggles. And I've got these heavy work gloves that still allow me to manipulate the targeting computers. And then I've got these big mag boots for the times when the airship really gets rocking, and so these heavy boots. Of course, I've got my Celtic dragon pin to identify me as a member of your crew, and my facial hair is trimmed to military specifications. So
You look quite spiffy, Ben.
I'm prepared. Yes, excellent. So this is a show about how we procrastinate, how we, survive when we're not doing the work. So what has been something that has been pulling you away from your writing in pop culture, for example, these days?
Well, I kind of blush to confess it, but I'm a Bridgerton fan. I like the juxtaposition of the Regency era, which I enjoy writing as an author, but also bringing in modern elements in the music choices, culture, and diversity of the production. It's a guilty pleasure. I love the show that not only features romance, but one of the main characters is a secret woman author. During that time period, women could not have professions unless they were the lower class, and even then, they were limited. So this character is a modern convention, but delightfully so.
I have gotten into Bridgerton as well. So my wife, I got her into all things Star Wars, and she has gone way into Star Wars, and she got me into Bridgerton. And I am the second half of this most recent season behind. So no spoilers on these most recent four. I've got four to catch up on, but I have really enjoyed it too. The acting is fantastic, and I love those little musical stings where you go, I recognize that. So that's a Nirvana song being played in this classical style. So yeah, it's a really delightful show.
Yeah, the funny thing is, I didn't catch the music at first. I think because I would just always watch the dancing and I
Yeah,
loved the costuming and all that. I think it wasn't until the second season that I suddenly noticed. And then, of course, I noticed it everywhere. And it was
right.
really a delight.
Yes, I don't think I noticed it at first either. And then there were, they were doing some dance, and I was like, "This song, oh, this is really clever." So yeah, it's very well done in that way. It's just subtle enough that you can kind of make a game of it. Can you name that tune as you watch the show?
Mhm.
And the it was really funny. The second season, my wife did not like it at first, and she was like, I don't like it because the main male protagonist is such a jerk. And I was like, well, of course he's a jerk. They're doing Pride and Prejudice this season, and Pride and Prejudice is her absolute favorite. Like, she reads Pride and Prejudice fanfic, she loves Pride and Prejudice, and she was so mad at me. She was like, "Oh, you're right. He's Mr. Darcy this season." And of course, by the end of the season, she loved it. I was like, yeah, that's because it's Pride and Prejudice. And she was like, oh, you're
In his defense, he is a very time period. That's the way
yeah,
many lords were in that
yeah, he
time. He's
was,
actually very progressive for the
yeah.
time period.
Yeah, but he's, aloof, and he doesn't come across as particularly
Exactly.
interested in her, and she takes offense, and I mean, it's Pride and Prejudice. This is great. So yeah, I just taught Pride and Prejudice in my high school classes, and
Oh,
my
wonderful.
students, thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a lot of, because I feel like especially my creative writing classes, I want to have a kind of a breadth of the kinds of things that they are exposed to. So often in creative writing, we go for these texts that are beautifully constructed and beautifully written, but that aren't genres that particular my students are ever going to write in. And I'm like, no, Pride and Prejudice is also beautifully written, incredibly well crafted. And if you are interested in writing romance, you need to read Pride and Prejudice at the point. So
Yeah,
it was fun.
Austen really was the progenitor of the romance genre.
Yeah,
All the things that you see in her books, which were brand new at the time and very avant-garde, are now the basis of what we consider the romance genre.
yeah,
So it's a wonderful book to choose, I think, for a creative writing class and for any general English class. It
yeah.
is a true classic.
And then we do the first few pages of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, just so they can get a flavor for what was done there. And that one's really fun. It is very well constructed. I admit I read them in reverse order. I read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and I was like, I'm feeling really ignorant. I don't know how much of this is Pride and Prejudice, and then read Pride and Prejudice many years ago. And I was like, oh, Pride and Prejudice is really funny. He didn't add the humor. It's a genuinely funny book.
It
So
is.
people don't understand. I'm trying to remember the name of the author, Indian author, Nobel Prize winner, wrote Midnight's Children.
Hmm.
Somebody out there listening is screaming his name right now at me, but he was talking about classics, and what happens when a book gets labeled a classic is suddenly people stop reading it and understanding why it was enjoyed in the first place, and presume it's ponderous and not enjoyable. And all of his stuff, Salman Rushdie, see, somebody out there was yelling it, and they're like, finally he got it. And Salman Rushdie's books are very funny, and Jane Austen as well. And she really was incredibly witty. So folks
She
who have
was a
not read
witty
your Jane
woman
Austen,
for
check her out.
sure. Hmm.
So what is a news story that's been pulling you away?
Well, actually, I've been reading a lot about a humpback whale named Twain and the efforts of Whale SETI to communicate with him. Whale SETI, I don't know if a lot of people have heard about it, but it's a branch of SETI, but to practice talking to alien species from the stars, they thought, why don't we start with our select, our people here, our creatures here. So they're trying to learn to communicate with whales. They are up in Alaska. They put like this gizmo in the water that emulates the whale song. And out of the blue, because I think their new technology is a lot more crisp, their recordings are better. than it has been long in the past. A whale came up from her pod, circled the boat, and was basically repeating back the whale songs that they were putting out, and in exactly a syncopated time, like
Yeah.
20 seconds later. And she circled the boat for 20 minutes. And from what I've read, the whale got very frustrated at that point. Because imagine this, if someone was talking to you, you understood, but they just kept repeating the same phrase over and over. You'd have to have a lot of patience to even stick around for 20 minutes. I think this whale really wanted to communicate.
Right.
Perhaps in the whale community, maybe this is something they want to do, and
Yeah.
this was maybe a first opportunity for them to do it. So the nickname of Twain was given to this whale because, Mark Twain, of course, was very
Yes.
communicated at his time. And I'm just fascinated by the whole concept. I've actually been writing a series of poems based on this, and I'm hoping to have them published shortly. So it should be a lot of fun.
That is really cool. I love that this news story comes across the transom and it's not part of your work explicitly and then becomes part of the work. Are you thinking of doing the series of haiku for that one as well? Or are you
I
going in a
have,
different
I've
style?
actually written a series of haiku based on this concept, and I've written a nonet poem. A nonet is a 9-line poem. It starts with 9 syllables, goes to 8, to 7, to 6, on down until you get to one final. That's been kind of new to me, but I've been enjoying it. And in fact, my latest Dwarf Star nominee poem was a nonet. It's called UAP, published in Starline. So it was just nominated for the Dwarf Star.
I have not worked with non-ets before, and that would be a really good one to add to my in my creative writing classes. We try as many different varieties of poetry as we can because learning those different styles, each one improves your skill set in some other way, And so that
Exactly.
would be a really helpful one for helping my students learn just how to identify syllables. Students really struggle with that. They have a hard time identifying syllables in words. And so a
You need
nonet
to
would be
learn
a
to
great
teach
practice.
them to listen with their ears,
Yeah.
and to speak the poems. And I actually just use my fingers and I
Yep.
count syllables that I hear on my fingers. I mean,
Oh, it's hilarious,
call me
man.
old fashioned,
No,
but
no,
I
this
do
year
it.
when I'm
But one
doing
thing about a
sonnets,
nonet poem, as compared to the haiku that I'm known for, is that the development of a nonet is very similar to a haiku, because in haiku, again, I'm paying a lot of attention to the the syllabus. Can I speak here? The count of
yeah.
yeah, well, you
Yeah.
know.
Oh, yeah. No, I do the same thing. And we do haiku as well. And that's one of the early ones. And I try and explain to students haiku are simple, but that doesn't make them easy. They're very, very difficult to write well. And yet you can start
Yeah,
the
there's
first
there's
one.
actually a lot more to haiku than meets the eye.
Yeah.
I know a lot of teachers go, "Oh, it's only 3 lines and simple." There's
Oh,
actually concepts of the ma. There are cutting words. There are kigos, which are
yeah.
seasonal words. And then when you switch over to science fiction haiku or scifaiku, which is my specialty, there's slightly different rules, because in space we have no seasons.
I was
So
wondering about that. Yes.
what I do as a writer is I also add the concept of time to my kegos. And so I reference a time, a single moment in time in a lot of my poetry, and it stands in for that kego, and it seems to serve the same function.
I
Now, I know the
really
haiku purists out there are probably going, no, no, you can't. Yes,
no, I
yes.
mean I
I
think
am a
that's
poet
entirely
laureate. I
legitimate to
will tell
say.
you, you can use time as a kego.
Yeah,
So
no, I think that's a wonderful solution to that challenge of how do you make a reference to nature in the vacuum of space? For example, time instead. I'm going to play with that as well. I may steal that from you and use that in my classes because I think it's a great way to in fact I purchased your book today.
oh, thank
I
you.
like to encourage my students to see that poetry can be used in any genre. And so I teach a science fiction lit class, and we have a unit where we do sci-fi poetry to
Oh, excellent.
get beyond just sci-fi novels, sci-fi short stories, sci-fi films. How do we show them that sci-fi can cross these different media? So that will sci-fi coup will be really cool, and I like that idea of time in lieu of nature. That's clever. Um, so, but this project of the of Twain is really fascinating. So, what have you been kind of playing with in terms of the concepts in the poetry you've been working with that?
Oh, with Twain?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's
This
kind
way.
of part of my regular process. I actually subscribe to a lot of science journals, and I pick through them to find articles that interest me as a poet, because as a science fiction writer and poet, this is where I get my basic ideas of writing. And for instance, with the planets, I based a lot of my poems in that book on the physical and the historical articles about each of these nine worlds in our solar system. So I had a couple of poems based on our historical interaction. Like, for instance, Pluto was named by a young girl who was the granddaughter of an astronomer who brought the name Pluto, which she wanted to name the planet, to the astronomers organization and took the vote, and that's why Pluto has its name. So Venetia's Wish, which is the poem I wrote, that was her name, Venetia. And I used that as a basis of one of my poems in my book. That one's not widely published. You actually need to get the book to read that one.
Yes, yes.
But all of my poems are that way. I like reading science anyway. I've been a huge NASA buff my entire life. I think I started writing science fiction because I saw Neil Armstrong walk on the moon live when I was a small child. And ever since then, I have been utterly fascinated with the cosmos. And when I became a writer, I think that's why I gravitated to science fiction, but it's also what is the basis of my poetry as well. And being a speculative poet is not that unusual. I mean, I admit most people think of literary poetry when they think of poetry, but there are actually thousands of us out there around the world who write poetry based on science fiction, fantasy, and horror themes.
Yeah.
And we're kind of the I don't know, the stepchildren of the science fiction writers. We're at the same conventions, we publish in the same magazines, but we're slightly set apart and different. And we're not always accepted. As a poet laureate, and now, of course, co-chair of the poetry committee at SFWA, one of the things I'm very passionate about is bringing speculative poetry into our science fiction community more fully.
Yeah.
And so I'm working on that with lots of event planning and just doing what I can. And I've been doing this probably for a good 10 years anyway, even before I got the titles. So
Yeah.
this is just something that I do and that I'm passionate about.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, I've been to writing conferences where there were simply no poetry offerings. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, encouraging planners to remember poets. We're here too. We're part of the community. Um,
Absolutely. And I think poetry is becoming more popular with our modern age.
mhm.
Attention spans seem to be shrinking. So maybe a longer novel is a more weighty choice for a reader. They still do read them. I'm not saying they don't. But poetry, being short, is far more accessible now. And if you publish a collection, that is very much a book as much as a novel is. So I think publishers are taking more notice of poetry now for that reason. Readers are reading it more often because they see it on Instagram and TikTok and all these other places. Short poetry fits into these kind of social platforms very easily. And I think it's having a resurgence, maybe a new renaissance even in our modern age.
Well, I completely agree, and I think I was talking to the former poet laureate of the state of Oregon, whose name I'm blanking on now. Super nice guy, and one of the points he was making is that poetry, there's an immediacy about poetry, where if somebody wants something that is responding to, if both the poet wants to respond to something that is going on in the world in a very immediate way, and the reader wants that immediacy, you can produce a poem in, a few days rather than the years it takes to write a novel. And with the modern social media, if you're willing to kind of sacrifice the ability to poet and publish it in a journal or something, you can toss that poem out into the world right now, and that has led to abundance of kind of half-edited works that get tossed out into the world, but it also means people are reading a lot more poetry that is response to what is going on both inside of us and in our world right away. And I think that's a wonderful thing that poetry can be kind of the almost like a headline news of the literary world now. We can respond very quickly. So
Yeah, I agree, except I would like to caution any budding poets out there about throwing your work up on social media before it's published.
yeah,
Because once you showcase it on social media, your first publication rights are gone. So I would caution you and say try to publish it in a journal first.
yeah,
It could even be a journal where you're not paid, but at least you get a writing credit. And then after that point, it's fair game to put it up on social media. I know in my local community here in Anaheim, I've been mentoring a lot of our local poets, and this is something I've had to really put home to them because a lot of them were used to just throwing their work up wherever and then wondering, oh, why is the journal not accepting this?
right.
And I had to explain it's because you've already, quote unquote, published it because
Yeah,
you put it online.
yeah,
And when they came into my journal that I put together for the city, some of them were wanting to put their stuff up, and I had to say, "Look, guys, I this is a community anthology. I will look the other way, but you should not be doing this because other publications will not be as forgiving."
yes.
And I think I brought that message home to them. So,
Yeah, and
and they're all doing fabulous, by the way. I'm very proud of all of
yeah,
them. I've watched them go from people reading their classroom essays at the open mic and thinking, "Oh, I like writing, but I'm not really a writer," to realizing, "Oh, I am a poet. Oh,
mhm,
I've been published in the community magazine. Oh, I was nominated for a pushcart. Oh my God."
right.
And now they're so excited they just want to keep writing, and some of them are actually doing their very first book deals right now.
Oh,
So and this isn't just a 2 year time period during
yeah.
my term, and I am so proud of them. I
Oh, that's
really.
wonderful. Yeah, it's so rewarding when it's that transition of thinking of themselves as writers. That's one of the things I work really hard on with students is that these people that we are assigning you to read are your peers. You are a writer too, and you're learning from this peer, but you aren't, they're not some person on high. They're your colleagues. And I think that's a wonderful when you see them start to say, I'm a writer. Like that's a wonderful feeling. That's excellent that's worked so well. So when you're not writing and you're escaping Bridgerton, you're pulling once you've gotten through Bridgerton, what's another hobby that has been occupying your time lately?
Oh man, I actually love urban sketching. I like to go out with my fountain pen and watercolor paint, and I take my sketchbook to other cities. For instance, when I'm traveling to conventions to speak, I like to sketch the hotels or the decor in the hotel, and I try to capture the feel of the event. But I also go out to local places like a movie theater. I just sketched one of those just because I happen to be going there for a writing group. And I thought it turned out pretty well. I had to wait 2 hours for the train because I took the train to go to the meeting and I had all this time. So I just pulled out my paint, sat at a cafe table, and I painted and what I closed up and went on home. It worked out really good. It fills a lot of time and it gets me off the computer screen.
Mhm.
I don't know if your listeners suffer from a lot of writing fatigue, but I know I do. As a writer, I spend so much time staring at a computer screen or in my tablet or wherever I happen to be writing, that I need to find ways to escape that. Now, as a poet, I do compose most of my poetry in a paper notebook with a fountain pen. And that again helps with the getting away from the screen. But I find I'm really enjoying the watercolor painting. Now, I don't claim to be a very good artist. I don't, you'll notice I don't ever put my watercolor paintings up anywhere. They really, my goal is to learn to do people, at least stick figure
Mhm.
people. But for me, it's not a matter of doing art to show off to people. It's more of me using it to relax. And I started my sketching skills with Zentoggles, if you've heard of that.
Mm.
It's basically teaching yourself to do patterns on paper,
Mm.
and you have like a small square and you fill it with patterns that you're taught via the Zentoggle education system. Well, over time, it trained my hand to be more steady, to do
Mm.
straight lines, to see the patterns to put into sketches. And I actually do sell Zentangle art combined with my poetry at science fiction conventions now.
Oh,
So,
that's
in
cool.
fact, I'm bringing some to Worldcon this year, as a matter of fact. So I will be in their art show. Uh,
Yeah. Oh, that's
but
fantastic.
but my watercolors, no, I'm still working on that.
Yeah.
So
Have you
eventually
found
it'll come together, I guess.
have you found that that practice has then influenced the way you see the world and therefore influenced your writing?
That's a good question. I do know that as a 3D coder, I started to feel that way. For instance, I'd be out on the golf course with my husband, and I would see the green, and instantly a grid of the green would show up with all the dimples, and I was shooting my putts that way.
Right.
And so that's the artist's eye.
Yeah.
I know with colors, I'm learning to see shapes more than objects and things of that nature. So I imagine in writing that's going to start influencing me. I know as a poet, a lot of my prose has taken on a kind of a poetry feel. There's a cadence to it, a rhythm to my writing that was not there when I first started. There's a real marked difference from what I wrote as a budding NaNoWriMo writer to what I do now as a poet. I mainly write poetry today, though. I would like to return to novels. I actually have like 7 novel drafts sitting on
Right.
my
Right.
computer,
Yes.
like a lot of us, and I would very much like to finish more of those. I did manage to get The Curate's Brother done, but I have 3 sequels that are semi ready to go. I think I'd like to add a couple more story threads to them that have come up as I wrote book 2. I ended up developing a bunch of extra characters that I want to carry into books 3 and 4. So I need time to do that. But as a community organizer, time is something I don't always have a lot of. And
Right.
so thankfully poetry I can still continue to write and publish, but longer works it's a little bit more difficult because I have to schedule more time to work on them, as I'm sure all your novelists who are listening realize. So I guess that's one reason I'm not writing.
Well, but I think that the poetry, I mean, I'm sure you found this as well. The work of writing poetry makes all prose writers better writers. Like
Yes.
I think of some of my favorite novelists, and they are poets, and it's because they have honed the kind of economy of language and that sense of how does this sound to the ear? And so those of us who process a novel in an auditory way, are you can tell, oh, this person writes poetry also. They've got Atwood. I love Atwood, Margaret Atwood's prose. And I bet if I've never had a chance to speak with her one-on-one, but I'll bet if she were confronted, she would say she's a poet first and foremost. And that even though she's more famous for her novels, I think she thinks of herself as a poet and it comes across in her prose. Like every paragraph, you're like, this is a poem. Octavia Butler had these passages in her work that were clearly poems, and even her prose often reads like poetry. And I think that so you're honing that skill set you are working on your novel every time you're writing a poem.
Well, I think that's why I started writing scifaiku poetry, being a science fiction writer. I took a class via the University of Iowa. They have free online classes every year, and if your readers are interested, I would urge them to look it up. The courses are excellent. But the course I happened to take was using haiku to learn your setting to write it better in a novel. And I thought, wow, what an idea. And it turns out, when you write haiku, you're getting down to a single moment in time. You're condensing a large world down to a tiny little place. And when you do that, you learn the place very well. And if you do the poems first, then you can expand it out into the novel. Well, being a science fiction writer, I went, well, I'm not going to do haiku. I'm going to do scifaiku.
Yeah.
And that's how a lot of this stuff got started. So, yeah, poetry is a good thing to learn as a
Yeah.
novelist, I would
Oh
think.
yeah, it's I feel like it's an essential skill set, and it's unfortunate for the folks who kind of skip it and say, "Oh, I don't do that." Try it, try and see what you can, how you will benefit, because it really is wonderful. So I like to ask authors about this question as just a way to kind of get to know folks. So I know D&D is not your thing particularly, but if you think about kind of those fantasy worlds, something like Lord of the Rings, and if you were, not creating a character, but you yourself, Wendy Van Camp, were a character in something like Lord of the Rings, what would be your race and class?
Well, I think if we're referencing Lord of the Rings, which is one of my favorite books, um, I think I would probably be a hobbit. I love to cook, I love to garden, I'm really short. And usually, when I'm going to airports and people are picking me up, I describe myself as Hobbit woman to others
Yeah.
so they can recognize me. And it seems to work. People immediately connect me with hobbits. Now, I don't have the hairy feet, thank goodness. But otherwise, I'm very hobbit-like.
And do you, similar to that kind of group, do you find yourself kind of, admiring and longing for the kind of the simple life, not the great adventure, but the caring for the home and creating a community of comfort around yourself? Are you fit
Well,
into
yeah,
that?
let's just say in my younger days, I had a lot of adventures. Some were very dangerous adventures. And now I find that adventures make one late for breakfast. And I prefer to be in my home. I'm a homebody. I live very comfortably here with my husband and two fur babies. And I have learned to value peace and quiet. And I'm really grateful that I'm able to have that here. I mean, I do live in a very normal American track housing track. Yeah, the neighbors throw wild parties once in a while, but it's okay. I feel I have a roof over my head. I'm grateful for it every day. I have a very tiny backyard, which is very typical here in Southern
Yeah.
California. Um, but I find I'm a homebody. I do love to garden. I haven't been doing as much in recent years well, even during the pandemic, I didn't do much gardening. And now, of course, I do so many speaking engagements. My gardens tend to die through lack of care. I'm just not around to water them enough. But I have a fondness for chili peppers. I'm a real chili
Mm.
head. I love to grow exotic chili peppers in my garden when I can. Um, and then what I do is I harvest them and I dry them in a little dehydrator I got at Walmart. And I grind them up and I have all these exotic chili powders that I use in cooking throughout the year.
Oh, that is very cool. Yes, and chilies do so well in your climate there in Southern California too.
Well,
That's
you'd be surprised. You have to, believe it or not, they need a shady spot because it's too
Mhm.
hot here for them. But I have a little stretch on the side of my house that I wouldn't really be using anyway. And I built up like what they call a square foot garden or I build up the soil high so I don't have to bend so much, which is nice. But it also allows me to create the proper nutrients in the bed, and the side of the house provides them with plenty of shade and they flourish there. All my peppers love it. My other vegetables, not so much, but the
Yeah.
peppers love that location. My garden there is only a foot and a half wide, by the way.
Which for chili
That's all
peppers
you
is
need,
still a
one
lot,
plant down the
right?
road. It's 15 feet long, but it's very narrow.
So you're probably aware of this. Do you know why chili peppers evolved to be so hot?
I think it was to prevent animals from eating them.
To prevent any animals except birds, because birds have no taste buds in their beaks, and so it spreads the seeds. So I've got a
Ah,
friend who really likes, incredibly hot chili peppers, and he's, just burning himself incredibly with all this stuff. And I say, evolution is trying to tell you not to eat that. You don't have a beak. What are you doing?
well, I suspect your friend has built up a tolerance
Oh
for
my
the
gosh, yes, the
taste.
hottest. He goes
So
by the like Scoville rating, and he'll go to the highest he can find, and it is. It's, and I'm just like, oh, that just looks
Well,
painful.
I admit I stick with, I think the hottest I usually go for is the Serrano. And if I do use a habanero, it's spread out in like a jerk sauce. So it's been watered down, so to speak.
I
So
made the mistake once. I grew habaneros and I made the mistake of trying to make a salsa that was habaneros, pineapple. I can't remember what else, and there was some tomato, but the habaneros were way too much. It was
oh yeah,
nobody could eat
yeah.
it. It was just,
If
and
you
I was like,
want a
lesson
hot
learned.
salsa, I wouldn't go any hotter than a Serrano.
Yeah.
And really stick with the jalapeno, you're a little bit better off.
Yeah, yeah. It was not kind to people sampling it. Try this; it's painful. Well, we're going to go to our break, but when we come back, I'm going to ask you what you've been daydreaming about lately. Special announcement time. NotAPipe Publishing has always been committed to helping authors and readers find one another. Well, the show, which is all about helping readers get to know writers, just hit a milestone: 10,000 views on YouTube. So to celebrate, instead of charging authors to advertise their books on the show, I'm going to run your ads for free throughout 2024. If you want to make a 30 to 60-second video about your book, let folks know what it's about and where to find it, and don't forget your name and the title. I'll run one or two of those in our ad spot each week. Just send an MP4 file to the NotAPipe email address in the show notes. Let's fix up some readers and authors into reader relationships. 2024. More readers, more writers, more books.
Bold Rising. Algo and their team of enforcers take on the underbelly of Geneva megacity before being sent on a mission to Mars, a cesspit of corporate exploitation. Suan, a child laborer, must turn the heart of Agent Algo while the fate of Mars, her friends, and her family hang in the balance. Cold Rising. Cold Rush novella, available now on Amazon.
In 1883, the famous German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche put forth the idea of the Übermensch, the Superman. In my latest novel, Project Übermensch, Geoffrey Cannon is either a modern-day messiah or the product of a military experiment gone awry. Either way, the young, inspirational guru has mad powers and metaphysical skills. But Geoffrey's life as spiritual healer and speaker takes a dark turn when some devotees, young women he's had brief affairs with, are inexplicably murdered under grisly circumstances, and rumors of Bigfoot, Sasquatch abound. Amazon is the best place to find my books. That's Lonnie Busch, Busch with a C like the bear. I hope you'll check them out.
No one wants to live in a country ruled by wizards, unless the alternative is worse. Peter Watts, author of Blindside, says, a near-perfect blend of implacable horror, gallows humor, and ecological apocalypse. Nick Namadas, author of The Second Shooter, says, relentlessly radical and often hilarious. Cascade, Book 1 in the Sleep of Reason trilogy, by Rachel A. Rosen. Available now at bookshop.org, Apple Books, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and at bppress.ca.
Welcome back. I'm here with Wendy Van Camp. Wendy, when you've been daydreaming lately, what have you been daydreaming about?
Well, how about plans to colonize Mars? And that it seems to be stalling right now. I really feel it's important for humanity to be on more than one planet. I think it's a safety measure for our species, no less. And going to Mars will not just be for the faint. It's not going to be for the faint of heart, though. It's going to be tough. But it is something that we should be doing in the near future and not put this off any longer. But that's kind of what I've been thinking about. And I've been a real proponent to going to Mars for a very long time. And in fact, I often joke I'd like to be Mars' first poet laureate, but
Yes.
well, what are the
Oh,
odds?
how cool. Have you ever read this one? I'm holding it up so folks can see it. Scatter, Adapt, and Remember. by Annalee Newitz. Highly,
I have.
highly recommend. Science writer. And she writes this fantastic book about all the extinction events over the course of our planet's history and what made it possible for the species that survived to continue, and the ones that couldn't, why they couldn't. And she makes this excellent case that it is about the ability to maintain some memory and learn some lessons and evolve, and also to continue to change our ecological niche. Like, we just need to keep spreading out, and otherwise, and so limiting ourselves to one planet creates a lot of risk. And yeah, and so I'm a big proponent of spreading out throughout the solar system. That being said, I think you were mentioning that it seems to have stalled, and I think it's because there are a lot of people who are interested in it, but for the wrong reasons. They think we should go to Mars to make money. It's probably not going to be profitable. Like, not for a long, long time. We're not gonna
I
mine the
don't
moon.
know
We're not
about
gonna,
that, Benjamin. I think that anytime humanity has gone to a new location, profit usually follows. We
yes.
don't know what Mars has to offer. We don't know what's going to be developing there over the next century. But look at the United States as an example. When people first started immigrating here, and of course there were natives here already, natives who had flourished with great civilizations that died down afterwards, unconnected with the European people that came through. But when the Europeans came here, they died in droves. They did not know how to survive here. They didn't know what was here. They were fleeing persecution in Europe, and that's why they came. It was almost like their last option. Or some of them were criminals who were imported here by the crown because they were basically being sent to no man's land.
Right.
And that's what we were for a long time. But funny how things change. Our populations began to expand, trade began to flourish, we became established, and eventually, of course, we developed our own nation. And now I don't think anyone would argue that the United States is at the forefront of the entire world when it comes to technology, education, and so on and so forth. Not to disparage anybody, of
No,
course.
no. But I think it's
But
an
if you
excellent
think of
metaphor.
Mars in the same way, yes, it's going to be difficult when people first go there. People will probably die,
Oh, yes.
but you sign up for it and you realize the risk. But eventually, colonies will be established. It'll be a tough life at first, probably for decades, maybe even a century. But eventually, we will take hold and will spread out, and a new culture will arise that finds Mars to be very normal. And eventually, new technologies and things will develop there, and they will have their own things to share, to trade, and just like it happened here. I mean, and this is a story that has been perpetrated throughout time.
Well, and
If
I think,
you
but
think of
I
the ancient
agree. I
people
think
leaving
that
Africa and going to Asia, I mean, it's the same thing
right, but I think
over and over
I
again.
agree. But I think your metaphor is actually very apt. The wealth that was to be gained from colonizing the quote unquote new world, new to them
Yes,
world, was in the short term for the benefit of Europe, right? And when we went to the moon, the benefits were not for the moon. The benefits were for Earth. We got titanium, and people who have wheelchairs have the NASA to thank for the fact that they can, lift that wheelchair into their car, because we, invented all these. The reason for space exploration isn't for space; it's for us, right? And we
right.
learned so much. The fact that my cell phone fits in my pocket is thanks to the fact that we went to the moon. We will learn an incredible amount when we go to Mars about how to live better here. And then you're right, in the long term, that knowledge will then transfer to Mars. But I think these
Exactly.
billionaires who are saying, in the short term, I want to profit from a trip to Mars, there's not going to be a short-term benefit to Mars exploration. We have to be committed to the idea that this learning is worth doing for its own sake. And then
I
the
agree.
learning is, and so if I trust scientists, the people from NASA, to be really thoughtful about how we could do that. And I'm very skeptical of the billionaires going, I'm going to build a villa on Mars. Like, you don't understand. It's going to be a really hard place to live for a long time.
Yes, I agree. But I think also, in regard to space, I think it's very important that we start developing ways to keep track of asteroids that are coming to
Mhm.
Earth. If you think about it, most extinction events that happen on Earth is because a rock fell from the sky, landed, and changed the whole ecosystem. The dinosaurs that died planetary wide from a huge asteroid that landed. I think it's important that we track these darn things
Yeah.
and that we learn of ways to move them out of the way if they pose a danger. And this should be a higher priority too.
Yeah.
Now, people are going, oh, it only happens once every what? Yeah, but it does happen. And
It
it
could happen
happens on
anytime.
a regular basis. The last one, I think, landed in Russia, for goodness sake.
Well,
And
and
it created a huge crater and wiped out a whole bunch of Siberia.
yeah,
Granted, it didn't hit in the middle of a metropolitan area, but what if it had?
right.
Think of the loss of life.
Yeah.
And I think this is something else that needs to be thought about a little more often, because, the sky may be falling
Right, right. Well, and when it
eventually.
comes to extinction events, I mean, this is interesting. Certainly, we have the extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs, or most of the large ones, and turned the small ones into our birds. But the first great extinction event was caused by global climate change. It was blue-green algae changing the atmosphere to make it inhospitable to themselves. And
Correct.
no species ever since has been stupid enough to make our atmosphere something that it can't breathe until us. And I think
Mhm.
one of the things we would learn from going to Mars is how to live in a far more sustainable way, because people on Mars wouldn't be able to be so wasteful. And those learnings about sustainability would be a way of preventing that potential extinction event here too. How do we live within our means? Because people on Mars wouldn't be able to go, we'll just buy more from Walmart. There's no Walmart next
Well,
door.
it's also a good place to practice terraforming.
Exactly.
If we could practice on Mars, we might be able to use those same techniques to help heal our own world.
Yes.
But I do think we need to just start now, being a little more conscious of what we use, of our electricity use, of our pollution, of our own waste management and things of that nature, and try to curtail some of that first. And then hopefully, as science catches up with us, we will develop ways of getting some of that carbon back into the earth and out of the air
Yeah.
and equalize things. I am a science fiction writer, so the idea of managing our weather and managing our air through technological means is not that unusual to me. I mean, I've been reading about such things since Heinlein and
Right.
Asimov,
Right.
since I was a small child. So it's not a new concept to me. And I do have faith in our scientific community. They are hard at work at this. If you follow the sciences at all, you'll realize this is an incredibly exciting time in almost every branch of science.
Oh yeah.
Breakthrough after breakthrough after breakthrough are happening right now. And it's astonishing, it's exciting, and I got to say, it makes the future very interesting.
Yes, I in my sci-fi lit class, I say to the students all the time, you don't understand how lucky you are. You're living in the future. Like all these things that, our great sci-fi author progenitors were writing about, so many of them have come to pass. And that's really cool that, that things are moving so quickly that we'll watch a film or read a book and come across some concept and I'll say, you don't understand how wildly imaginative this was when it was written, and now it's just something that's commonplace to us. And
That's
you're
true.
right, it's because science has made a lot of it into reality, which is
And who's to say that science fiction wasn't actually the progenitor of the idea, and the engineers just took it from the book and went, wow, that's a good idea, and they made it come true.
yeah,
So I really think the writers of science fiction, we have a duty to maybe write a more positive future, to think of solutions instead of just dystopian
yeah.
ideas. But that's my personal take. Other people
No,
can
I
they
I
want,
agree. I think one of our
but I
challenges,
think a positive outlook of the future is important.
Yeah, the solar punk movement is, a movement of folks who are interested in science fiction that is more positive. Look for solar punk. It is trying to embrace a positive future. The challenge I had, I was asked to write a solar punk story, and the challenge I had was writers naturally we want there to be a conflict in the story to create drama. And when you're trying to create a positive vision, and you're also there's a tension there where you've got to create dramatic tension, and so you don't want to create a utopia on page one because then what do your characters have to struggle with, but we also don't want to contribute to just creating a pessimistic vision of the future. So I admire solar punk writers who manage to kind of navigate that tension in a clever way. So, what's something else that you want listeners and viewers to be aware of that's going on right now?
Um, well, I guess for me, personally, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about being a survivor of Cushing's disease. It can be fatal if left untreated, but it's often not diagnosed due to its rarity. Only 1 in 14 million people get it. The illness left me disabled for over half a decade, and all that time at home. At first, I didn't write at all because I was just so sick with fatigue, very despondent, not knowing if I would survive or not. But once I kind of mellowed for a few months, I began to realize that I had a choice. I could either sit in front of the TV and feel sorry for myself, or I could sit in my home office in front of my computer and write. And I chose to write, mainly poetry and essays. Because of my illness, it left me with the ability of not being able to focus on things for a long period of time. So that was a real incentive for me to look at poetry and essays. And all the essay writing that I ended up publishing right after my brain surgeries um, actually have led to me being a contracted writer at Indie Author Magazine. I published so many writing essays over the next 2 years after my surgery that it laid the foundation for me to be hired. It also, I think, led to the reason why I emerged from my illness and became a poet laureate. I mean, because I was publishing so much poetry, and with the advent of the pandemic and Zoom, I could basically go back to speaking from my chair here at home.
Yeah.
And even though I was too sick to get around, I could just sit here and Zoom and talk. And it just, and everything led to one another. And next thing I know, here I had this public office. Thankfully, I was able to get out by that point, both the pandemic closing down and also my healing happened enough that the fatigue was gone. A lot of the disabling aspects of the disease were under control by that point. So I was able to get out. You'll still see me with a cane now and then, especially if I'm at a conference and I know there's going to be a lot of walking. I do bring it with me just in case. I'm fine at short distances, but if I walk a lot, I find my balance goes out. This is not a holdover from Cushing's disease, which of course is a tumor that attaches to your pituitary gland, for those that don't know. It takes
I
over
did
the
not know.
function of your pituitary gland. And because of the high levels of cortisol coursing through my body from the tumor, literally every organ in my body was disintegrating. And I was given a diagnosis of basically not living more than 4 years after that diagnosis. But that was 7 years ago, and I'm still here, and I'm very grateful for every day I have.
Yeah.
Um, Anyway, I am slightly disabled, but I still lead a full life. And I want people to have compassion for the disabled, but also to know that with help of modern technology and understanding, if life does hand you trouble of this nature, you can keep writing. Don't give up. Let your inner muse be free and guide you. And I'm living proof of that. So.
Yeah, well, and we were talking about, the fact that we get to live in such an amazing time in terms of technology. I'm
Mhm.
sure 10 years earlier, there's no way they would have been able to treat it. I mean,
That is very true. The surgeries that I went underwent were only developed maybe 15 to 20 years before I did them. I actually talked to one or two people that had undergo the procedure as part of the pilot program.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they've refined it since in the 7 years, but it's still, it was a disease that basically killed you if you got it 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So I thank God for modern medicine every day.
Exactly. I
really
mean,
do.
doing well 7 years later. So I don't know much at all about Cushing's disease. I did not understand that kind of mechanism. So is it a specific kind of cancer at that point? I mean, it's a tumor, right?
It is a tumor. It's considered more benign, but it's not technically a cancer,
Because
but
it's not
it
spreading.
might as well be. It has almost all the aspects of it. It's the fact that it attaches to the pituitary gland and takes over its function that is the problem. Your pituitary gland is considered the master gland, and it's up here in your head, right at the base of your brain. And it basically controls almost all the hormones in your body. And so my body was just flushed with too much cortisol 24/7. Naturally, you only have a certain amount of cortisol, a very low amount, and it's only during the day. At nighttime, it goes dormant. So my body was not getting that dormant period at all. And I was being flushed with 10 to 15 times the normal amount of
And
cortisol.
isn't cortisol the fight or flight response chemical?
It can be one of the symptoms is a deadening of emotion.
Yeah.
I was always kind of considered to be stony faced.
Mm,
People would make comments about how I didn't react to things the way that I maybe should have. And I found as I healed, I began to be angry a lot. That I guess because the suppression wasn't there,
right.
I'd be a hothead and I would react before I should. But that's because I hadn't really, I'd had this
You had
disease for 20 years. I didn't know how to deal with it. And I'm not normally an angry person.
right.
I'm really not. But it was learning to deal with this biological process, really.
Yeah.
Another thing that it does is it makes you gain weight. And at the height of my illness, I was close to 300 pounds in weight. I'm only 5'1". I'm a hobbit woman, right? So I was very large. I'm still an overweight woman, but I'm a good 50, 60 pounds lighter
Yeah.
than I was when I had the illness. And at least, and when you have Cushing's, it's almost impossible to lose weight.
Yeah.
Even my doctor said, try if you can. But one of the signs of the onset of Cushing's is gaining an enormous amount of weight in 1 year. People average anywhere from 60 to 80 pounds in 1 year. And that's just from the hormones causing it. Now, I've always, being a diabetic, I've always monitored what I eat. I only gained about 20 pounds. And that was so low that they weren't quite sure. But because of my body shape, they thought to check. And it turned out, yeah, I had an almond shaped and sized tumor attached to my pituitary. It was huge,
Yeah.
absolutely huge.
And so did they
Other
perform, so you
symptoms
said they
is it
performed surgery.
causes infertility. It causes memory loss. I was starting to suffer from some memory loss. And of course, I have a somewhat photographic memory that disappeared. For the first time, I had to write down a shopping list to go to the grocery store. Before that, I never bothered. I just knew what I needed and I'd go and buy it. Even if the list was 30 or 40, it didn't matter. I could see my pantry shelves in my
Right.
mind and I would just know what to get and what I already had. But I lost that ability. So I think maybe the happiest day of my life, other than the day I got married, is the day I was just sitting in my office. I felt something lift, something invisible. And suddenly my thought processes like tripled in
Yeah.
speed and my ability to remember came back. So now I'm that annoying woman that if you have a conversation with me, I'll remember every detail for the next 7 to 8 years and forget that maybe you don't even remember talking to me about
Yeah.
it. But I'm back to that state. But I'm used to that. I was that way all through my youth, so it's fine. It's normal for me. Um, and of course, when I was in school, I never had to study because I would read the book and I just remember it. Well, again, I didn't have that ability. Thankfully, that has also returned. So it's been a real roller coaster of experiences. It could really put anybody down. I mean, it was frightening, to be perfectly honest. When I went in for surgery, I didn't know if I would get through it. Some people do die from this surgery, but without it, I was dead anyway.
Right.
And anyway, they didn't get the entire tumor the first time, so a week later, I had to go through it again a second time. And I just want to say I thank God for my husband because he stood by me through this whole thing. I actually asked the priest to come before I went into surgery, not for me, but for my husband
Yeah.
to help comfort him because
Yeah.
he was, oh, I've never seen him just so, I'll never forget the way he looked when
Oh,
I woke up in the
terrifying.
hospital room. And he did everything. I was not allowed to pick up more than 10 pounds. I wasn't allowed to sneeze, not allowed to cough because the surgery goes up through your nose,
Yeah.
creates a hole at the base of your brain, and then they go in that way. So I don't have scars, thank
Right.
goodness. But yeah, but it made me weak there.
Yeah.
And so my husband just picked up everything. He did all the housework, he took over the cooking, he took over the grocery shopping, and he worked full time. And I don't know how he did it all
Yeah.
because it was a lot of work on his part. And of course, me, I was just sitting there on the couch.
Right.
Eventually, I went back to writing, of course, but I wasn't allowed to do anything,
Yeah.
and
Which
it
is
went on for
frustrating
a
to not be
long
able to
time.
help. Yeah.
But yeah, I am grateful for my husband every day. When you get married, sometimes these things happen, and I'd like to think I'd be just as adamant if something happened to him. But we're a team. We're
Yeah.
definitely a team.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I am not I'm not surprised to hear about those symptoms based on that description because in teaching, one of the things I've had colleagues who've dealt with this, when you experience a lot of what we call vicarious trauma, you can have a cortisol response where your cortisol gets all wonky, and they can now test for that and find that out. And those symptoms you were describing are similar. If you're
Yes.
in addition to the adrenaline of a fight or flight response, the cortisol, the excessive cortisol of that sympathetic response leads to the sense that you're in crisis all the time. And it
Yes.
leads to lack of ability to focus. It leads to weight gain because your body's going, preserve, preserve, preserve. I might need this. It leads to a sense of um, uh, uh, that kind of lack of affect that you were talking about because you're going, I'm in crisis. I'm in, I need to deal with this emergency situation right now, even when there's no emergency. And so it's,
Yeah.
you seem emotionally kind of deadened when in fact you're really heightened. And so I can imagine if you then had a tumor that were putting you in that state all the time, it's
Mhm.
incredibly dangerous. So I'm so glad to hear that it worked.
It does. I'm experiencing true calmness for probably the first time in my
I'll
life since
bet.
my early 20s, and
Yeah.
it was very difficult to get used to it. But now, of course, I'm grateful for it. I like calmness. Like I said, I like to
Mhm.
garden. I'm a hobbit, and yeah, I'm just grateful to actually be having a normal response and to do that. And like I said, I still walk with a cane occasionally, but I think it's a small price to pay
Oh yeah.
for what I've gained.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's a good lesson for everyone out there too, that finding that peace is literally life and death. Like not being able to find calm is dangerous to your body and dangerous to your health. And you were in a incredibly precarious situation because your
Yeah.
body wasn't letting you be at peace. You know?
I honestly think my writing is very different now too.
Mm,
I think because of that inner peace. I find I write better when I'm in a peaceful state, in an analytical state. And I was having trouble achieving that before and I didn't know what the reason was back then. But looking back, I think that's why I was always kind of angry
mm,
all the time. I'm not at anybody in
right.
particular. It was just this biological
Yeah,
response that
it's
I didn't
chemical,
realize
right?
that there was something wrong because I was so used to it. But now, of course, I feel a lot of peace. I'm able to get a lot of work done. I'm able to focus on longer term projects. So I wonder too if that's why my novels never really got off the ground is because of the illness and my
Yeah.
lack of being able to focus on the long term. So I'm kind of curious to see what I finally come up with.
Yeah.
Now that my poet laureate term is over, I still have a bunch of conferences to do this summer, but I'm setting out time for myself this fall, and I think I'd like to try tackling a novel again.
Yeah.
For me, I just need to set up the time to do it. I like to write maybe at the coffee house, and I set up writing sessions for myself where I leave the house so I don't have my husband asking me to do things when I'm trying to write, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners can relate to. But I do well with that. I just take my laptop, or if I'm writing in poetry, I take my notebook and fountain pen, whichever way. But I like to set up writing sessions for myself outside the home,
Wise.
even though I have a lovely home office that I'm very happy with. But I just find that new location helps spark a little bit more creativity in me.
Me too. I'll go
And
to
I'm looking
conferences and I'll
forward to
find that
trying
I write
something
a whole
longer.
lot in the hotel, not because hotels are wonderful writing spaces, but because it's a new space.
Hmm. That's true.
Yeah. So I think it will be really fascinating to read your next novel in light of your previous ones and see how the tone has changed. You may write a very different book for the next book than your previous novels because of, chemistry, essentially.
Yeah, that's true. The Curate's Brother is my debut book, and I wrote it quite a number of years ago. And since then, I have progressed so much as a
Mhm.
writer just naturally because of time. But also, I've been a poet all these years, so that influences me. And now, of course, I have that different chemistry to be able to focus long term. And from what I see of my drafts, they are going to be very different than the first book. But I think that'll be a positive.
Yeah.
I feel a lot more confident with my novel writing these days than I did in the past. Well, of course, in the past, I was just a NaNoWriMo novelist out there with the other beginners and finding my way. Eventually became an ML for a number of years. That's where I got my community experience, shepherding other writers. Really, I didn't know that much more than the other ones did, but
Right.
they always asked me for some reason. I have a face, I guess, that people just ask me questions. I could be at the supermarket and people assume I work there. At my last conference, people were asking me directions of where to go, with that, just assuming I knew everything.
I
It
bet
was
it's a
my first time there and I
combination.
didn't know, but
I'll
I
bet
did
it's a
my best.
combination. I'll bet it's a combination of you look knowledgeable, but you also look safe. I think that's probably it. You don't look like you're going to then attack them.
Well, that's true. The Hobbit woman is short and kind of plump, and she's
Yes.
very. I don't have a. I'm not going to do anything to anybody anyway.
Yes. They're like, she looks like she
I
knows
believe
her
we
stuff
should
and
lift
she's not going to
everyone's boat.
hurt me.
Yes, yes, that's true. But yeah, it's been quite a journey, quite a
Yeah.
journey. But I like to bring it up when I do podcasts because I know there are people out there with disabilities of their own, and I just want to be supportive of them because they're going through maybe more than what the average writer is going through, but it's okay. We all have something,
Yeah.
and you're not alone. And technology is there to back you up when there are things to help you that weren't around maybe 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's a brave new world.
Yeah. Well, and also a disease like Cushing's disease is largely invisible. And so
Mhm.
learning to treat people, to recognize the people you meet every day, you don't know what's going on.
That's
And
right.
to treat people with the grace of, recognizing this person's got struggles that you don't fully understand.
That's right.
But yeah, the fact that you were able to, turn that into something positive in terms of your poetry is very inspiring. So I hope people hear that as well. You can find a way to live a very full life thanks to things like Zoom. I mean, Zoom is a cool sci-fi technology that has allowed us to engage, across the world. I know people resent the heck out of it because we were trapped with it during COVID, but imagine COVID without it. It would have been a lot worse.
That's right.
So it's really
That's
cool.
right. Yeah, I
Um,
read stories of people during the Black Plague and what they did. There were a lot of novels written during that time, by the
yes.
way.
Yes.
But yeah, they didn't have the the ability to get out via Zoom the way we did.
Yeah.
And there's virtual environments too now, which are fascinating in their own way.
Yeah, my son spent a lot of COVID playing video games and on Discord with his friends. And he was, I would say, more social during COVID. He was continually with his friends, and that
Mhm.
wouldn't have been possible 10 years earlier. So,
That's right.
it could have been worse.
Indeed, indeed.
So I wanted to ask you, what's on your TBR pile? What is something you're looking forward to checking out?
On my to read pile, that is a good question. I think one of them is A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge. I used to bump into Mr. Vinge while attending conferences and conventions here in Southern California. He's a local, and I really enjoyed his insight into technology and science. A lot of times I would go to his panels because he always seemed to have a greater insight into things like AI, what was going on in space, and he was good friends with a lot of top name scientists. And of course, this is why I purchased his Hugo Award winning novel, A Fire Upon the Deep. He is no longer with us, very sadly. So A Fire in the Deep has been snuffed
Mm,
out.
yeah, but we will
Um,
put a link to it in the
but
show notes
I
so
feel
folks
his
can read
books are
that.
still very worthy to read, and I would recommend it. Unfortunately, I still have it because it's in my to read
No,
pile,
that's fine. I mean,
but I look forward to it.
absolutely. My to be read pile is, dangerous always, but that sounds really fantastic. So we will put a link to that in the show notes through bookshop.org so folks can find that and also support their local independent bookstore, and we'll get that out there. Um, so in the light of our kind of attention economy that we deal with now, finding a controversial take is a desperate way people try and get attention. And sometimes I think it inclines people to, be awful just for attention. And so to challenge that, what would be your hot take? Because I don't think you're going to go the awful route. What is your hot take?
What is my hot take, huh? Let's see. What is my hot take? Well, I think coffee is the juice of life, I guess. Many of us operate on coffee and sheer willpower. So let's give caffeine the credit it deserves. How's that?
That's excellent. Have you heard the theory that really the Industrial Revolution can be attributed to the rise in coffee and tea drinking?
I think I have heard that, and I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I think coffee was something from the Middle East,
Yep.
and it came into Europe, and it developed the coffee house culture of the 18th, 19th centuries. And this is where all the poets would meet and discuss, and what the huge poetry renaissance of that time period, and the novelists and all that. But it wouldn't have come together without coffee. Now, there is an exception. The Irish poets all met at the bars and they drank whiskey. So
Right, right. No,
that
but
was
yeah,
their thing, but I think everybody else did coffee.
yeah, coffee was New World, so it had to be brought to Europe, and tea, as you said, comes from the East and
Mhm.
came in, and when those were popularized, everyone in Europe used to be kind of low-level drunk all the time. They were drinking alcohol 3 meals a day, and it was because to be a teetotaler, to drink water was dangerous. The water was so unhealthy. The people who were drinking, what we would consider very strong beer every meal, even children, that was how you kept going. And then, so you imagine this entire society where everyone's drinking, beer every meal, switching to a society where everybody drinks coffee and tea every meal, and suddenly they were so much more productive.
Well, at that time period, the reason water was unsafe is they didn't understand about germs or that
Exactly.
you need to boil your water to make it safe. And so people would get sick drinking plain water.
Yeah.
I mean, even today, if you go out to like your local creek up in the mountains and you drink it, it's full of bacteria. It's
Yeah.
going to make you horribly sick. There's signs everywhere telling you not to drink the water. But they had to deal with that. And their way of dealing with it was that they called them small beers. So there wasn't a high amount of alcohol in these products, but they were fermented. And the fermentation process took out the bacteria. That's why everybody drank it, because it was safer to drink it because
Yeah.
it was processed. So they weren't really all getting drunk. I mean, I'm sure there were stronger beers that the men
Oh yeah.
imbibed in, but for women and children, the small beer, which maybe only had a very small amount of alcohol, was more acceptable.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I could still see there'd be quite a shift between coffee and a small beer.
Suddenly, everyone is going from something that is alcoholic to something that is caffeinated. That's going to
Mhm,
change society pretty dramatically.
mhm.
So yes, we have this unfortunate tendency to view history through what a friend of mine, who's a historian, calls the great man of history model, where we say, oh, it's because of this person or that person, and it's really not. It's these giant social movements, and a switch from alcohol to caffeine probably had a much greater effect than any one individual.
I agree. I agree.
So, where can folks find you and your work online?
Well, you can find me on my website, wendyvancamp.com. This is a portfolio site, so it has all my writing credits. A lot of my stuff is able to be read for free online. So if you want to read my poetry, go to my poetry section. If you want to read my short stories, I have something for that. I have links to the myriad of podcasts I've been on. You can find my books on Amazon. I do have an Amazon page there. I also write on Medium, and my handle there is at W Van Camp. I usually will reprint a lot of my essays there, my poetry. Once it's published, it ends up on Medium. And I have a few things that are just only on Medium too. So it's a great place if you just want a single source to read, if you have a membership there anyway, that you can read my work there. I do have a Twitter account, although since it went over the change in management, I'm not there as much anymore, but you can still find me there. But I think my heaviest social media is Instagram.
Mm.
And you can find me there at No Wasted Ink. I publish on Instagram regularly. You can see my poems. You can see where I'm reading, the things I'm involved in. It's pretty busy there. And then finally, I do have a newsletter. It's free and monthly via Substack, and it's nowastedink.substack.com. The newsletter has an opinion piece, which is just me rambling. I call it my ramble. I do a writing essay, so a little more serious piece in the middle, and then I always feature one of my poems of the month, which is usually a haiku or scifaiku poem. I list all my recent appearances, either publishing, podcasting, or in person or Zoom appearances, links to all my books, that kind of thing. It also comes with a voiceover done by me.
Oh,
So
cool.
it's kind of my little mini podcast. So if you get the newsletter, the voiceover just comes with it. But you can also just subscribe to just the podcast version, which I call my Ramblecast. And that's kind of fun too.
Well, and that's a nice accessibility feature too. I mean, there are
Mhm.
different folks who need different ways of reading, and so you reading a piece is helpful. That's excellent. So, and folks can sign up for the newsletter via Substack. Is there a link to that on the website as well?
Yeah, you should be able to find it on my website, to everywhere. So
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
fine.
Well, we will post links to all those things in the show notes. So, folks who are listening to the podcast right now or watching it on YouTube, you'll see that below. So, check out Wendy's website and the Substack. That sounds really cool. And then, by all means, buy the books. We always want to encourage folks, buy the books. So, who else is somebody you would recommend I have on this show?
Well, I was thinking maybe if you'd like to do another poet laureate, why not Brian Sona Wallace? He's a rather active poet laureate here in the LA area. He's from West Hollywood, so he represents the LGBTQ community quite well. He's well published and he's a good speaker.
Ah,
So,
that'd be great.
oh,
Actually,
and he's referred to as Mr. Rent-A-Poet,
Mr.
by the
Rent
way.
Poet. I love
Yeah,
it.
he got his start with his typewriter at craft fairs doing poems on the fly for people.
I would love to talk to him about how those experiences, because I'm sure they, I'm sure he's got some stories. That's great. I will reach out. That's a good call. Okay, so before we get to our send off, there's some folks I need to thank. Thanks to the artist Max Oakland, who reached out and provided one of his songs for our intro song, I Prefer the Dusk. Let Max know you like it by following him on Twitter at Max Oakland with 3Ds. And thanks to Halizna CCO for their song Kids for the ad break. If you're in a band and you'd like your song used on the show, I'd love to highlight a listener's work like Max's song, so email that to me. Thanks, as always, to Doug, the producer, for making this show sound good and taking the blame when it doesn't. Thank you, Doug. And I cannot forget to mention Writers Not Writing is a production of NotAPipePublishing. So please go to NotAPipePublishing.com, check out the amazing books written by writers who didn't procrastinate too much. And there is a coupon code in the show notes for a discount at the online store there. And if you like Wendy's work, please go and rate and review. It makes a big difference to authors. So give it that 5th star, and you'll make Wendy's day. And same thing for this show. Click on that little thumbs up there on your app, and that really helps people find us as well. So Wendy and I have some advice for you going into your week. So Wendy, what's your advice for everybody?
Maintain a positive mindset. I'd like you to focus on the positive aspects of life and practice gratitude to boost your mental well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that, a book without spaces would be gibberish, and our lives need spaces too. So don't ignore the spaces. And third, no matter how much you procrastinate, Wendy and I are still proud of you.
Indeed.